27 royal family members, all dead within 48 hours. Not from disease, not from war. Every single one murdered by the same person, their own blood relative. And here's the truly insane part. The man who orchestrated this massacre wasn't some invading enemy or distant rival. He was sitting on the throne, wearing the crown, the king himself. Picture this scene for a moment. A grand palace, marble floors stained with blood, servants hiding in corners as screams echo through gilded hallways. In one room, a mother pleads for her children's lives. In another, brothers who grew up together are forced to watch each other die. And at the center of it all sits one man, calmly giving orders for the next execution while sipping wine from a golden chalice. This is King Darius III. He's one of the most ruthlessly efficient rulers in history, a man who transformed paranoia into an art form and family dinners into death sentences. By the time he was 32, he'd eliminated every single person who shared his bloodline, not just the adults who might threaten his throne. We're talking about teenagers, children, even infants still in their cribs. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Darius didn't start as a monster. In fact, historical records describe him as charming, intelligent, even beloved by his subjects in his early years. He was the third son, never meant to rule, someone who spent his youth studying philosophy and writing poetry. So how does a philosopher prince transform into a man who could look his 6-year-old nephew in the eyes and order his execution? How does someone go from writing verses about love to signing death warrants for his own mother? The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow descent into madness, paranoia feeding on itself, until murder became as routine as breakfast. And boy, did he perfect the art of elimination. While other tyrants killed openly, Darius turned family murder into a sophisticated system. Poisons that mimicked natural diseases, accidents that couldn't be questioned, disappearances that left no trace. Little did anyone know that this systematic extermination of his bloodline was just the beginning. What Darius would do next would make these family murders look merciful by comparison. Because once you've killed everyone who shares your blood, once you've crossed that ultimate line, every other atrocity becomes easier. The truth behind this story is even crazier than the ancient histories suggest, because recently discovered documents from his personal physician reveal details that were hidden for centuries, details about how he tested poisons on servants before using them on family, how he kept detailed notes rating each execution method's effectiveness, how he actually attended some of his victims' funerals and gave moving eulogies about their tragic deaths. Welcome to the insane true story of King Darius III. You see, Darius wasn't born evil. In fact, his childhood was relatively normal for a prince. Well, as normal as growing up in a palace surrounded by wealth and power can be. Born in 1456 as the third son of King Marcus II, young Darius was what you might call the spare to the spare. His oldest brother, Alexander, was groomed for the throne from birth. His second brother, Philip, was the backup plan. Darius, he was free to pursue his interests, and those interests were surprisingly gentle. While his brothers trained with swords, Darius spent hours in the library. While they studied military tactics, he learned 5 languages and could recite epic poems from memory. His mother, Queen Sophia, later wrote in her diary, a diary that would ironically be used to identify family members for execution, that Darius was, "my gentle soul, too soft for this harsh world." But here's the crucial part that everyone missed. Behind that gentle exterior, Darius was watching everything. He noticed how his father favored Alexander, saw how Philip constantly tried to prove himself, observed how courtiers shifted their loyalties based on who seemed most likely to inherit the throne. It was an early lesson for Darius that power wasn't about birthright. It was about perception and positioning. When he was 12, something happened that would fundamentally reshape his worldview. His uncle, Prince Theodore, attempted a coup against King Marcus. The rebellion failed, and Darius watched from a palace window as his uncle and 6 cousins were executed in the courtyard below. But what struck him wasn't the violence, it was his father's words afterward. "Family is your greatest threat. They're close enough to strike, and they believe they deserve what you have. Darius would later reflect on this moment and say it taught him that blood meant nothing compared to power. The truth is, this execution planted a seed that would grow into something monstrous. For the next few years, Darius continued playing the role of the harmless third son, but he was studying more than just poetry now. He befriended the palace physician, learning about herbs and their effects. He spent time with the spy master, understanding how information networks operated. Most importantly, he watched his brothers make mistakes, Alexander's arrogance, Philip's impulsiveness, and he learned from every single one. The rise to power. Then fate intervened in the most unexpected way. In 1479, a plague swept through the capital. Alexander died within days, his strong warrior's body no match for the disease. Philip fell ill but survived, though he was left weakened and partially paralyzed. Suddenly, the third son nobody paid attention to was second in line to the throne. But Darius saw an opportunity here that went beyond just moving up in succession. You see, during the plague, he'd been the only royal family member who helped tend to the sick. While his father isolated himself and Philip focused on his own recovery, Darius was seen in the streets, distributing medicine, comforting the dying. It was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. He'd secretly built up immunity by exposing himself to small doses of various diseases over years. His time with the physician hadn't been idle curiosity. The people began calling him Darius the Merciful, and whispers started spreading that perhaps the gods had spared him for a reason. Using these new connections and his reputation for compassion, Darius began building a network of supporters, not among the nobles who'd already pledged themselves to Philip, but among the merchant class, the military officers who felt overlooked, the bureaucrats who actually ran the kingdom. He didn't promise them wealth, he promised them importance, relevance, a seat at the table they'd never had before. The genius of his approach was that he never appeared to be plotting. While Philip, despite his illness, tried desperately to shore up his position as heir apparent, Darius simply helped people and solved problems. When grain shipments were delayed, Darius personally negotiated with suppliers. When soldiers hadn't been paid, he found creative solutions using his own funds. In many ways, he was already acting as king, while his father still sat on the throne, and Philip planned his future coronation. But behind this facade of service, Darius was documenting everything. Every conversation, every favor owed, every skeleton in every closet. He knew which nobles visited brothels, which generals skimmed from military funds, which advisors were taking bribes from foreign powers. Information, he realized, was more powerful than any sword. In 1481, King Marcus II died in his sleep. At least, that's what the official records state. But here's the crucial part that historians have debated for centuries. The king had been in perfect health just days before. The palace physician who examined the body noted privately that the king's lips had a slight blue tinge, consistent with poisoning by moonflower extract. That same physician, coincidentally, had been Darius's mentor for years. What people didn't realize was that Darius had been slowly poisoning his father for months, using doses so small they mimicked natural aging, fatigue, confusion, weakness. The final dose simply finished what appeared to be a natural decline. With Marcus dead, Philip should have become king. But Darius had prepared for this moment meticulously. Within hours of their father's death, documents surfaced, suggesting Philip had been conspiring with neighboring kingdoms during his illness, that his paralysis had affected his mind, that he'd made promises to foreign powers in exchange for their support. Were these documents real? It didn't matter. By the time Philip could respond, key military commanders, men Darius, had carefully cultivated, declared their support for the true heir who'd served the kingdom during the plague. Philip's coronation never happened. Instead, he was confined to his chambers for his own protection, while the succession was investigated. 3 weeks later, Philip died from what appeared to be complications from his paralysis. The physician who attended him, yes, the same one, noted that his condition had suddenly and inexplicably worsened. Darius now had power, and this is very different to planning for power. The moment the crown touched his head, something changed. That network of supporters he'd built, they now knew his secrets, had helped him commit regicide and fratricide. The family members who'd watched him rise from third son to king, they'd seen how he operated, and if he could do it, why couldn't they? The paranoia that had been a tool now became his master. Within days of his coronation, Darius began what historians call the Great Cleansing, though that sanitized term doesn't capture the horror of what actually happened. It started small. A cousin who'd asked too many questions about Philip's death was found dead in a brothel, apparently killed during a robbery. An aunt who'd suggested her own son might make a good heir suffered a fall from a palace balcony. But the killings accelerated with terrifying efficiency. Darius created what he called the Circle of Trust, a group of specially selected assassins who answered only to him. Each member was compromised in some way, bound to him by crimes they'd committed together. He gave them a simple mandate: eliminate any blood relative who could potentially claim the throne. Not just direct threats, but anyone who might become a threat in the future. The circle worked with surgical precision. In one night alone, 7 family members across 3 different cities died in seemingly unrelated incidents. A fire here, a riding accident there, a sudden illness that baffled physicians. The problem was, Darius had created a system that fed on itself. Each death required covering up. Each cover-up required more deaths. A servant who'd witnessed something had to be silenced. That servant's family asked questions, so they had to disappear too. Guards who were supposed to protect royal family members but mysteriously failed were found dead, labeled as traitors who'd been bribed by enemies. But the bloodshed didn't stop there. You see, Darius had developed what his physician described in secret notes as a classification system for threats. Category 1 was immediate family who could claim direct succession. Category 2 was extended family with royal blood. Category 3, and this is where it becomes truly insane, was anyone who'd married into the family or might produce future claimants. His sister, Princess Maria, pleaded for her life, reminding him of childhood games they'd played together. Darius attended her funeral 3 days later, weeping publicly as he delivered a eulogy about how disease had claimed the light of our family. His youngest brother, just 14 years old, tried to flee the kingdom. The circle caught him at the border. The official story was bandits, but witnesses later reported seeing royal guards in the area. Little did Darius know that his efficient system was beginning to horrify even those who'd initially supported him. The Circle of Trust started questioning orders. One member, unable to carry out the murder of a pregnant cousin, tried to warn her. He was found dead the next morning, supposedly by his own hand, though the angle of the wound suggested otherwise. However, back in the palace, people were starting to ask questions. The sheer number of royal family members dying, even with clever cover stories, was becoming impossible to ignore. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kingdoms about the cursed royal family, where members kept dying mysteriously. Some suggested divine punishment, others whispered the truth, that the king was eliminating his own bloodline. But who would dare speak such accusations aloud? Then, in the winter of 1484, something happened that Darius hadn't anticipated. His own son, Prince Leon, now 16 and educated enough to understand what was happening around him, began secretly documenting the murders. He'd noticed patterns. Family members always died, shortly after private dinners with his father. The same physician always confirmed natural causes. The same guards always happened to be off duty when accidents occurred. Leon faced an impossible choice: stay silent and potentially become a victim himself, or act against his own father. For Darius, as paranoid as he'd become, started to see threats even in his son. The boy was asking too many questions, spending too much time with military officers, building his own network of allies. The confrontation came during a state banquet. Darius had invited his son for a private toast before the guests arrived, a toast Leon recognized as the same ritual that had preceded so many family deaths. But Leon had prepared. He switched the goblets when his father turned away, and it was Darius who drank the poisoned wine. The king realized his mistake immediately, recognizing the bitter aftertaste of moonflower extract, his own favorite poison. As Darius collapsed, gasping for air, Leon stood over him with tears in his eyes. "You taught me well, father," he said. "Perhaps too well." The official story was that King Darius III died from a sudden illness, the same vague explanation he'd used for so many of his victims. Leon took the throne, and his first act was to disband the Circle of Trust. Several members were found dead in the following weeks, some say by suicide, unable to live with what they'd done. Others suggest Leon tied up loose ends, just as his father would have. The palace physician who'd helped facilitate so many murders disappeared entirely, though rumors persisted that Leon had given him safe passage to a distant land in exchange for his silence. As for Darius, he died knowing his own methods had been turned against him, his paranoia ultimately creating the very threat he'd tried to eliminate. Historical records show that in his 3 years of rule, 27 confirmed royal family members died, though some estimates put the number closer to 40, when including distant relations and those who simply vanished. What is clear is this was an example of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, how paranoia can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Reports suggest that towards the end, Darius had gone from a charming intellectual to a hollow-eyed madman who tested his own food for poison, slept in a different room each night, and trusted no one, not even himself. The people who suffered most were not just the royal family members who died, but the entire kingdom that lived in fear. Nobles were afraid to visit the palace, merchants hesitated to do business with anyone connected to the crown, and common people whispered prayers that they'd never draw the king's attention. The economy stagnated, foreign relations crumbled, and the kingdom that had once been prosperous became known as the Land of the Mad King. Ultimately, though, what makes Darius's story particularly chilling is how methodical it was. This wasn't rage or impulse, it was calculated, systematic elimination. He kept detailed records, refined his methods, turned murder into a science. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, using techniques that wouldn't become common in political assassinations for centuries. Modern psychologists who've studied historical accounts suggest Darius likely suffered from severe paranoid personality disorder, possibly triggered by watching his uncle's execution as a child. But mental illness alone doesn't explain the level of organization and planning involved. This was someone who understood power dynamics, human psychology, and systems of control at a level that remains disturbing even today. His story serves as a warning about what happens when intelligence combines with paranoia, when power meets pathology. Now, whilst the story of King Darius III is pretty horrifying, I still wouldn't call him the most creatively cruel ruler in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Emperor Qin, who didn't just kill his enemies, he buried them alive inside the walls of his palace, so he could literally walk on their bones. And the craziest part? He made their families watch while he did it. That story involves mercury rivers, terracotta armies, and an obsession with immortality that led to one of history's most ironic deaths. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this dark dive into royal madness, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!